Ignorance. We are ignorant to the suffering of others, and on this Orange Shirt Day, all we can do is just to fight it one day at a time. I know that today I am a little less ignorant than I was yesterday, because by the time I finished editing the following video, I realized that I have many blind spots, so much so that I did not want to publish it at first. Please watch the video to the end, teach me what else I missed. I'm work in progress. Share your ways, and remember that truth and reconciliation is not just a day, but a process through intergenerational trauma. In 1996, vast majority of Canadians believe that they live in secular society. They will tell you about national values of multiculturalism and acceptance. They will tell you that Canada is the best country in the world because every individual can practice any kind of religion or belief system as long as it doesn't affect their neighbors. That was the same year when federal government and Catholic Church finished their 160-year experiment of converting 150,000 Indigenous children into Catholicism and impose on them Western tradition. This is me, Dr. Ruben Gagarin, your favorite family psychiatrist. On September the 30th, Truth and Reconciliation Day, we are talking about multi-generational trauma, how does it affect Indigenous communities and everyone else in Canada today, and what it may mean for the future. Like many others, I grew up in an imperial culture. So when I was growing up, I got this implicit belief installed in the back of my mind that my people and my culture is superior to everyone else. So when I came to Canada in 2002, I was completely ignorant to the suffering of Indigenous people. And that continued for a few years. I minded my own business, I was studying for exams and getting my medical license. I had to confront my ignorance when I met Jade. She was 15 years old. She was one of my first patients when I started practicing psychiatry here. Like many others, she was brought to the hospital against her will because she tried to end her life. She also was very emotionally dysregulated. She used self-harm to manage her emotions and also used drugs. After we dealt with the crisis, I continued to follow her in the clinic for over a year. And now thinking back, I think her example may be great to illustrate the lasting effect of multi-generational trauma on this Truth and Reconciliation Day. When I earned a little trust, Jade told me her story. She was born in the reserve to a family of very respected community member. Her father was very smart and charismatic. Many people came to him for advice. He was a great advocate for the community. However, at home, he often used cocaine, became very angry and violent towards her mother. She witnessed that. And at some point he passed away in suspicious circumstances. Her mother could not handle it, so she started drinking and using drugs herself. She wasn't taking good care of Jade. Other family members were not immediately available, so Child Aid Society, or Child Protective Services, that's how they called in the US, came and took her under their care. From the point of view of the social workers, they were really saving her life. They took her away from the poverty of the reserve and placed her in a successful foster home. She was enrolled in a regular school, and very quickly teachers realized that she was exceptionally smart, and she had a formal IQ testing that placed her in the top 2% of population. That means that she was smarter than 98% of people. She was very academically successful at first, but when she became a teenager, she started questioning her identity, and all of a sudden she started having anxiety, depression, mood swings. She started hurting herself because she didn't know how to handle it. And eventually, she developed suicidal thoughts and attempted to end her life. See, from psychiatric point of view, Jade being taken away from her family played into multi-generational trauma of residential schools when kids were taken away from their mothers to be converted into different culture. Many of them perished. We don't know how many. So far we found 1,300 unmarked graves, and many other sites are still to be discovered. Some people believe that between 6,000 and 60,000 kids perished in the system over 160 years history. So see, the same federal government that took the kids away from their families over 160 years also took Jade away from her community and from her family. Being in Toronto, she did not have access to her traditional cultures, but she still tried to play by the rules imposed on her. She was getting good grades, and she was thinking of becoming a doctor. Of course, I could respect that a lot. However, you can see that her decision to become a doctor of Western medicine creates great conflict from her traditional medicinal practices. She told me her grandmother was actually a traditional healer. And as you might know, indigenous cultures, they have completely different belief system, so they treat illnesses in very different way. See, generation after generation was torn away from their roots, from their family, from their land, and losing their identity likely led to more abuse within the family. So her father, for example, never learned himself how to manage his own temperament, so he used drugs for that, but then he ended up being abusive to his family himself. So evidently, her mother also didn't have great skills of managing her own emotions, so when she became sad and started grieving a loss of her husband, she also turned to drugs to manage her moods. And so did Jade, because she did not have a right role model to show her how to regulate herself. Instead, she was taken away from her culture, and then she found herself in a kind of foreign environment. Throughout our time together, she taught me a lot about indigenous culture, and through our conversations, I think she started developing some of sense of her identity. But see, I am also part of that Western culture and Western medicine, so it was not possible for Jade to develop complete trust. She agreed to see a therapist, she worked through some of the trauma. When Jade turned 16, she told me that she decided to move back to the reserve. In Canada, 16-year-olds can make decisions where and who do they live with. So she reconnected with her grandmother and decided to move back. From my Western point of view, that was completely counterintuitive, because I thought that she was on a path of becoming a successful person by my definitions. So she was getting better grades, she was on a path of potentially becoming a doctor, making good money, building her family. But what I didn't realize, that even that superficial success would probably leave Jade with a big emptiness inside. That is her identity, that is who she is. See, from indigenous point of view, we are occupiers. At some point, Europeans came here, pushed indigenous people away from their native lands, built their own civilization that indigenous peoples do not support. They would rather live in harmony with the nature, they respect land. That is very different from this culture that respects money and power above all. So what seemed to be counterintuitive to me made 100% sense to Jade. She stopped suffering living in this oppressive society. Eventually, Jade moved back to her community. She gave up a promise of prosperity in a Western society and returned back to her roots, family, and culture. She remained true to herself. I have not seen Jade since then. I hope she watches this video and may recognize herself, despite the fact that I changed many details and her name. I must mention that trauma runs through generations in multiple different ways. Even on a basic DNA level, although we inherit the same DNA sequence, but children born to parents who experience trauma get the genes expressed in a different way, so that DNA memory sort of preserves some of that trauma. We also received very many, probably thousands, of implicit subliminal messages that live in the back of our minds as a belief system. So when we see the world, when we make decisions, we only can do it using our belief system that may be corrupted by inherited trauma. Often, cultural trauma translates into individual culture and violence that leads to many psychological difficulties, including emotional dysregulation, substance use, self-harm, etc. Why do we have to talk about it today? See, September the 30th is the day of truth and reconciliation to remember 150,000 plus victims of residential schools in Canada. Why it is not only about the past, but also about today and tomorrow, the way how I see it, the Canadian government in 1830, in cahoots with Catholic Church, decided to open a network of residential schools to convert Indigenous kids' culture into something else. The children were taken away from their parents and placed in these boarding schools. What, for example, if federal government decides now that people who were born in Canada superior to people who immigrated here? And then they decide to take my kids to residential schools to convert them into old stock Canadians. What if at some point federal, state or provincial government decides that, for example, transgender kids not who they are and they need to be converted into normal kids and they do not deserve to have the same rights like everyone else? Oh wait, that is actually happening now in Alberta. So all of this, it is not only about huge tragedy of Indigenous people and residential schools that were operational until 1996. It is about now. It is happening now. Many politicians who run for the office, even as high as White House, blaming a lot of their own issues on immigrants. A lot of the time it doesn't make any sense. But what if they get elected? What if they decide that now immigrants do not deserve to practice their own religion or culture? They need to be placed in the special schools and converted into something else. Or maybe they are not, after all, welcome in Canada and they need to pass a value exam before they get admitted. Oh wait, that is actually happening in Quebec. So it is so important to talk about this issue now so we preserve our own identity. As a physician, I can tell you that it is not possible to have a healthy body if one part is rotten. And the relationship between Canadian government and Indigenous peoples became that rotten part. So until we reconcile this issue, treat it, fix it, help the communities to grow their own role models, let people practice their belief system freely, we cannot claim that we are sticking to our multiculturalism values and that we live in free secular society. So let's fight our own ignorance. Subscribe to my channel, leave a comment to start a conversation, and I'll see you again. Thank you very much.